All right, we're good.
All right, thanks everybody for joining. So we're going to be talking about executable campaigns today. So of course, where did my mind go when I thought executing American Psycho apparently? So that's what I stuck with. We're going to talk about this new feature in Marketo. Just real quick about me, I'm an associate platform operations consultant with Atumo, so I am Amanda's colleague. I'm a 3-time Marketo Engage champion and 2 times certified, shortly to be 3 times certified Marketo expert. So here's what we're going to cover during our session today. I'll talk about the differences between the new executable campaign type and traditional batch and trigger campaigns. I'll show a couple example use cases for how you might be able to leverage the features of the executable campaigns. And lastly, I'll share some things to watch out for while you're using executable campaigns because they are a little bit different. Just a quick disclaimer, currently executable campaigns are in beta and they're not yet available in all Marketo Engage instances. So if you don't see it as an option, it just may not be available in your instance yet. It is scheduled for the May 7th quarterly major release to North American customers. So if nothing else, you can probably expect to see them in your instance at that point. I'm not sure right now if they're still accepting any additional beta users, just because we're getting pretty close to that. It's about a month away. This is a good chance to kind of start thinking about it before you have them in your instance. Of course, everything's subject to change. As you know, things may be delayed or there might be different features involved as part of the general release. So be sure to keep an eye on the release notes page in case there are any changes to what is being included in the initial release. So first, we're going to talk about the executable campaign type and what makes it unique. So it's a new smart campaign type. It's separate from batch and trigger. So you'll notice it has a different icon. So if you're in the old UI, it's a yellow light bulb with a little gear. Sorry, the picture's so fuzzy. It's just such a small icon. And then in the new UI, it is a gray bulb with a gear icon. It's used only with an execute campaign flow step. So it's similar to request campaign, where you have a flow step in one campaign that says request campaign, you tell it to what campaign to request, and then on the other side, the campaign you're requesting has a trigger that says campaign is requested. So it's kind of that type of relationship, except executable campaigns only work with the execute campaign flow step. And the executed campaign that you call is going to complete entirely before the original campaign that called it moves on to the next flow step. So what's similar to existing trigger and batch campaigns? Most wait steps are available. So on the next slide, I'll explain why I say most. You can still have smart list filters to serve as additional criteria for exclusion. So you have criteria for the original campaign that qualifies them. They'll run through the flow step to execute the campaign. And then on the executable campaign side, you can have some additional criteria if you want to further narrow down who runs through it. You can also set qualification rules. So have a person run through the flow every 1 day, have them run through every time, or any of the other parameters that are options for other campaigns today. So you see here in the picture, these are examples of the wait, or, oh, I gave it away. I put most wait steps. I meant to put most flow steps. Well, anyway, we'll get to that in the next slide. But these are the examples of the flow steps that you will see. So a lot of familiar things there. So my brain was obviously on top of that because a couple notes here about what's different about executable versus batch and trigger campaigns. So as I mentioned, the big benefit there is that the original campaign is going to wait until all of the flow steps are complete in the campaign that it executes. Now here's the caveat here. You can't have webhook, wait, or execute campaign steps. So these are the 3 flow steps that you cannot have in an executable campaign. So kind of the philosophy around that is it has to guarantee that all of the steps in the executed campaign are complete. But webhook and wait and execute campaign steps all kind of involve waiting on something else. So it's a little bit harder for it to calculate how it would actually know when it's totally complete. And it might be delaying things. So that's not currently available. So what does that mean? You can't actually nest executable campaigns. You can't have one campaign calling an executable campaign. That executable campaign calls another executable campaign, and so on. You can't do that right now. It's a feature that might be coming down the line later, but right now that's not available. So in the end, you can only guarantee completion of one level of flow steps. So what's in that executable campaign is what is guaranteed to happen before it moves on to the next flow step. So you'll notice that there is no active or inactive status for the executable campaigns, and likewise, there's no scheduled or unscheduled status. You can see in the screenshot on the lower side that it just says the status is executable. So it's just always on. So this has some caveats that we'll talk about later as well. You can't switch between campaign types. So with batch and triggers, you can add in a new trigger and boom, now it's a trigger campaign. You take away the trigger, boom, now it's a batch campaign that can be scheduled or run. So executable campaigns must be set as executable at the time that you create them. You cannot also request or trigger executable campaigns. So you'll notice that in the screenshot on the upper side that you don't have any triggers as options. You can only pull filters into the smart list on the executable campaign. One of the big benefits of the executable campaign type is that it does not run through the trigger queue. So if you have a really busy instance or you process big batches of people, or there's a lot of things happening, sometimes you can get a bit of a backlog of campaigns that are waiting in the trigger campaign queue. So executable campaigns do not fall in line with that. They kind of operate on their own. So that hopefully will prevent some backlogs there. Another super awesome difference that is really usable is that you can inherit token values from the program of the campaign that executes it. So that means that you can have your executable campaigns living in one program, and then you have campaigns that execute it in any other program, and it's actually going to inherit the token values from all those other programs. So this really opens up a lot of opportunities for centralizing some processes while still allowing unique values to come from a program. So here's a lovely little diagram that tries to summarize a lot of these concepts around what's guaranteed to execute or complete and what's not. So what I'm looking at on the left side is you start with any regular batch or trigger campaign that has a number of flow steps. So when those flow steps are executable campaigns, it's going to complete that first one, the flow step A1, before it moves on to flow step A2. But what is actually included in that? So we already learned that you unfortunately cannot use wait steps, webhooks, or executable campaigns. So those are not allowed. But if you have more than one flow step in your executable campaign, let's say the first one is a request campaign, what it will guarantee it will do is request that campaign. But that's where it stops. That's the only thing that original campaign is going to make a note of having completed. So whatever happens in that requested campaign, so if you look all the way on the right, those steps are not guaranteed to complete before the original campaign moves on. So it's only one level of flow steps that it will guarantee. So it's really only relevant for request campaign. Anything else like change data values or setting any other kind of status or anything like that, that's all going to happen. It all needs to be completed before that original campaign will move on to the next flow step and then complete the flow steps within that executable campaign. So just want to reiterate those two things. So what is and isn't allowed in an executable campaign, and also that you only can guarantee the one level of flow steps. So an executable campaign, just that one level of flow steps within it, and not anything within campaigns that it might request. Okay, so now that you're super excited about these potential uses for executable campaigns with the guarantee of being completion and with inheriting the token values from the programs, let's talk about a couple scenarios in which this might be helpful. So the first one is when you want to avoid race conditions. So this happens a lot. When you have a lot of processes, especially for new people in your instance, you want them to run through all these different programs to kind of mark their status, standardize things, et cetera, et cetera. You want to make sure that everything's happening in order, because some of the processes might be relying on values that are being set in earlier processes. So what ends up happening is right now you might have wait steps where you're like, well, it seems like it normally takes about 10 minutes before it finishes all these other things. So I'm going to add a wait step of 10 minutes. Alternatively, maybe you just daisy chain everything together where the last step in one campaign requests the next campaign, the last step in that campaign requests the campaign after that, et cetera. So those are not ideal solutions now that we have executable campaigns. We'll have executable campaigns available. So let's say you have, as an example, you want to standardize a country value before you sync a person to the CRM, because the assignment rules are based on country. So just making that up, but you can imagine any number of scenarios where you might be relying on previous processes in order to complete the next. So with the wait step, there might be the problem that the wait step's too long. So it's actually already finished standardizing the country value, but now it has to sit there for 10 minutes anyway before it syncs to the CRM, because that's what the wait step you defined was. Or the wait step might not be long enough. So unfortunately, there's a big backlog of trigger campaigns. And so that person's still sitting in the queue, their country hasn't been standardized yet. They sync over to the CRM with the non-standard country value, or at least try to sync over, and the wait step was useless. Even though you had it in place, it still wasn't enough. So because it can't be guaranteed, wait step doesn't seem like an ideal solution there. And with daisy chaining, you have to kind of keep track of all the sequence of the processes and make sure all the campaigns are requesting the right one, and so on and so forth. So where executable campaign comes in is ensuring that that first process is completed before beginning the next. So here's an example of how it might be set up. So I just made a super basic, this is not based on anything I'd really put out there, but just to give it an example. So let's say you have a campaign to perform all the new person processing. By using execute campaign, I've put in, so the first one is to standardize the country, the second one is doing some sort of privacy compliance, third one is syncing to CRM. So this is similar to that example I just shared. So we have each of those execute campaign flow steps. So now what happens? So here's what is actually within each of those executable campaigns. So these are very simplified. So just keep in mind that maybe you would have a lot more flow steps or more complex flow step choices or whatnot, but this is to illustrate how it would work. So first, it's going to complete all of the flow steps within the country standardization. That was the first execute campaign flow step in the original campaign. So it's going to complete all of that. Then it's going to move on to the privacy compliance executable campaign. I just kind of simplified it here, but it did a couple things maybe, and then that is fully complete. So then the original campaign can go to the third campaign that it executed, sync to Salesforce, and it's going to complete that. So basically it ensures that the country is standardized and that we have the privacy compliance values in place that we needed before it syncs to Salesforce. So didn't need to have any wait steps there because it made sure all those other things happened before it syncs. Another really great use case for executable campaign is avoiding having repetitive campaigns across a number of different programs. So if you have the same flow steps that you would run across any number of different programs or scenarios, but you need to have program-specific values for them, that's why you have them across every program right now. So currently, you might just have a clone of that processing campaign in all of those programs. Or maybe you have one in a center of excellence program template where there's already some sort of process that includes several flow steps based on some activity of the person in that Marketo program. So the challenge with that solution, while it works very well when you're cloning a program template, it's always going to have all the flow steps in it. However, if the process needs to change, now you have some new field you need to stamp a date on, or now you have some other thing that you need to set as part of that program. Now you have to go back through all of those existing programs and add that step. So it becomes a little bit, there's a lot of work involved to try to update all of those because they're all dispersed across these different programs. So while they were all in sync to begin with, once you change what steps that they need, now you got to update all of them. So executable campaign might be a good solution in this scenario because you can have one centralized campaign that would allow all of those programs to run through all those steps while using the program custom tokens from the program that executed it. So right now, currently, while it's in beta, it's inheriting the my.dot tokens, so the custom program tokens, but more to come. I have a note in the later slide. By the time that this is released on May 7th, there will be more tokens inherited. So you can have one central version of this campaign with all the flow steps that you might need. So here's an example. I have some content program, awesome case study, and on that program, I have a custom token, content name, awesome case study, right? So I don't necessarily need to have the whole program name. Maybe I just want to capture what was the offer. I want to make a note that they looked at the awesome case study. Great. So currently today, I might have a number of different flow steps within a downloaded campaign. I might want to stamp what that offer was. I might, stamp what date they looked at it or things like that. Again, this is kind of a simplified example just to help illustrate the concept. So just imagine that you might normally have a number of different flow steps involved here. With executable campaigns, you can simplify that a bit. So instead of having all of my flow steps within this local smart campaign, all I'm going to do is I'm going to execute a centralized content fulfillment downloaded campaign. And you'll notice here, there is a little toggle within the execute campaign flow step, use parent campaign token context. So when that's set to true, that means that the executed campaign will leverage all of the tokens from this original program's token values. If it's set to false, then it'll only use the token values that are on the parent program of the executed campaign. But in this case, we want it to inherit the awesome case study value.
Nice.
So here's the centralized program. So again, this is I simplified it down. So imagine this could be a lot more complex depending on what your needs are for all the different processes that you need to run. So I made up a centralized content fulfillment program. I did create a local token here for content name, and I just put as a default, just kind of as a catch-all, unknown content name, right? So we do that for two reasons. We want to make sure that we have some value in case we forgot to have the content name identified on the original program. And it also helps make the link. So it may not be guaranteed that it would inherit a token that it doesn't actually have on its on the centralized program itself. And then in the flow steps on that executable campaign, I'm setting offer to that my content name token. So normally with our normal trigger and batch type campaigns that we have already, it would inherit that just from the program that that campaign lives within. So in that case, it would be inheriting unknown content name. However, because we set, I don't know if I can change back, because we set use parent campaign token context to true, it's going to take the my content name from that campaign that called it. So awesome case study. And you can see in the activity result, that's what happened. So even though my sample user downloaded the awesome case study and was processed in that program, because it executed the centralized content fulfillment download executable campaign, it pulled that awesome case study value from that original campaign and plopped it in. So there's a lot of opportunities here. This is actually something that's relatively new. It wasn't available exactly in this way earlier in the beta. So there's a lot more to be explored here, but this could be an opportunity to really centralize a lot of the similar processes so you don't have to build them under each program. If they're all doing the same thing, you can probably just share the token values by executing that campaign instead of just including it within the program itself. So what to watch out for? So not so much that there's a problem with executable campaigns, but because this is a different campaign type entirely, there's a lot of things that we might assume about them or just kind of forget that they work a little bit differently. So I want to kind of talk through some things that you want to think about before you just run out and start making a bunch of executable campaigns. So especially now, while it's still in beta, if you don't already have it in your instance, now's a good time to kind of think through how you might potentially want to use them or what might they be good for. So think through what pain points or challenges do you have today in your instance that the executable campaign type might address. So that could be things like we're having some issues with race conditions. We have redundant campaigns all over our instance. We want to kind of centralize them. To start thinking about some of the potential uses. Then think about, do any of those campaigns currently rely on unsupported rules or flow steps? So again, you can't have triggers on an executable campaign. It's just executed. And you can't have wait, webhook, or executable campaign flow steps. So if currently you're relying on a webhook, you probably can't convert it to an executable campaign at this time. And then think through how much effort do you think would be needed to convert to using executable campaigns instead of whatever you have set up today? And how does that compare to the benefit gained? So again, if you really think through, well, what's the real pain point here today? What are the issues that I'm facing? Am I having trouble with the wait steps are not working and things are getting processed in the wrong order? And that's a real pain. I end up having to troubleshoot. I end up having to, reprocess people all the time. Okay, great. So then there might be a real benefit to spending the time to rebuild some campaigns as executable campaigns. So along that vein, so when you're creating executable campaigns, there's a few things to keep in mind. As I mentioned, there's you can't really switch on and off the executable aspect. You can't convert an existing batch or trigger campaign to executable. It has to be executable from the very beginning. And so you would check this little box. You'll see in the Smart Campaign dialog box at the very bottom, there's a little checkbox to make it executable. So if you're creating a new campaign from scratch, you would check that box. You can clone an existing campaign that you have. If you want to reuse all of the flow steps that you had in the campaign, you just want to make it executable, you can clone it and check that executable box. However, you would have to remove any of those unsupported elements before you clone it. Otherwise, you'll get this error that says the campaign you're attempting to clone contains unsupported rules or flow steps. So again, that would mean you'd have to remove any triggers or you'd have to remove any wait or webhook steps before you clone it in order to make it executable. Two things in relation to workspaces. So if you have workspaces in your instance, please take note. The executable campaign must be in the same workspace as the campaign that executes it. So you can't just have, if you have kind of a centralized default workspace and then everybody else works in other workspaces, you can't just have a bunch of executable campaigns in that default workspace and expect others to be able to execute them. Unfortunately, they have to be in that same workspace. Likewise, a program that has an executable campaign within it, or that has an executable campaign flow step, cannot be cloned across the workspaces. So if you don't have workspaces, great, you don't have to worry about those. Otherwise, this might impact your ability to leverage them in the same way. A few notes around using executable campaigns. So the order that individual records enter the executable campaign, it may not be the same order that they complete it. So while it will always complete all of the steps within that executable campaign, you know, Joe Schmo is the first person to enter that campaign. Jane Doe comes in after. Jane Doe might be the first to complete the executable campaign. So if there's any reason that you need to have people go through the campaigns in the exact same order, so that they complete it at the same order that they started it, keep that in mind that it may not be that case. The smart list on the executable campaign must be valid at all times, so you can leave it empty. Again, the smart list on the executable campaign just provides another layer of criteria to further narrow down who will be eligible. Otherwise, it will rely on the smart campaign of the program that executed it. So really important though, because the executable campaigns are always on, they're always listening, right? So if you're in the process of adding in filters or moving them, you're typing in some values. If a lead is trying to come over into that executable campaign, it will actually fail to qualify. And in the activity log, it'll show qualified false. So that's why you want to make sure that it's always valid, because there might be people that are trying to come over at that time. So it's recommended to use a member of smart list filter on the executable campaign smart list so that you can quickly switch out to a new set of criteria to kind of have a hot list there. If you do need to have additional criteria on the executable campaign. So again, you don't have to have any. You can just leave it blank and it'll just be based on the qualifications for the original program that executes it. But if you do choose to have further criteria on the executable campaign itself, just make sure that it's valid at all times. So related to that, so what are some potential errors and what would be the impact? So right now, so I just mentioned that it'll show qualified false. Right now in the beta, it's actually just showing a skipped activity if a person fails to qualify for the executable campaign. But once we go into the general release in Q2, it won't be skipped, but it'll show qualified. So qualified true or false to express whether or not the person qualified for the executable campaign. If the executable campaign fails entirely, this should be fairly rare, right? If the campaign fails, the record won't be able to move on to the next flow step. So because of the functionality of an executed campaign must complete in full, if it's not able to complete in full because it failed, then the person's not able to move on to that next flow step. So that's going to be pretty rare. Good case for having the system notifications emailed to you if there is a campaign failure, so you can investigate. That would, again, it will prevent people from continuing on. However, if it is a tolerable failure, which I think is a funny term, but that's what it's called, such as a sync lead to Salesforce error message, it will continue to the next flow step. So if it's not an outright campaign failure, but a sync error, it will be able to continue on. It won't just get stopped. So I alluded to some of these things already, but because it's in beta and it's always in progress, there are some features that might be coming down the line. but may or may not be available at the time of general release in May. So one that will be available for the initial release is the inheritance of system program tokens. So in the example, I used just the My Custom token for the program because that's what works today. That's what's available right now. By the time it's released, you'll also be able to use program, trigger, campaign, and member type tokens. So you might be able to use program name, which would be a really good use case. So a lot of things right now, you might be looking at program name or, what the trigger URL or, things like that. There might be any number of system tokens you'd like to take advantage of in kind of a centralized flow step sequence. So that'll be really useful. It is on the roadmap to allow for nested executable campaigns, but there's no date around that. So we don't know for sure if and when that will come into being. And lastly, one other thing that they're looking for is lifecycle hooks so that it would be guaranteed to execute upon creation or deletion of a person record. So it would be kind of similar to the lead is created type trigger, except it wouldn't be triggered. It would just be happening, it would be executed based on that. So those are a couple of things that might be coming down the line that might further enhance what's available within the executable campaign. Okay, questions, comments? What do you think?
Yes, I think there are a few questions in chat, and I think this is very exciting. I'm going to stop the recording so we can all just speak openly with our questions and comments.